So generally speaking, you never really want to put full trust in the viewport playback. That's because, it can be very, very choppy. You can see it's kind of bouncing up and down. So what we want to do is Workbench render this out, and we can play it back from disk instead of from our 3D scene itself. So we're going to be rendering the animation out. So we'll go up to our render properties up here, and we have, this is essentially Workbench, which is just, the default shaded mode. This is going to be rendered mode. This is going to be Workbench mode. So a solid mode essentially. So I'll set our render engine over to Workbench. We have a bunch of different material parameters in here. I'm just going to leave all of this default. And then what I'm going to do is go to output, and then just make sure that you have your file saved before we do this. So for me, I have it saved out box version 6. And then under output down here, what I'm going to do is use // and then I'm going to do render. So whenever you do this // right here, this is referencing where you have the Blender file saved on your hard drive. So it's going to put the render directly next to it. So now what I'm going to do is just do another /, do box, and then another /, and we'll just do version 1, and then we'll do box version 1. And then I'll just put a dot after it like that. And then what we'll do here, we're going to get into image sequences in a bit, but for now I'm just going to switch this over to an MPEG video, which is just going to be a nice compressed video. We can do encoding, set this to something like high quality. And that's really that. We want to make sure we have our camera set up before we flipbook this out. Flipbook's another word for just Workbench rendering. And then let's just frame this up so we get it framed nice and good. Something like that. Pretty good. And then we want to make sure we have our camera set up. So we'll go into our scene properties, and we want to make sure our camera is set right here. So if you only have one camera in the scene, you shouldn't have to worry about this, but just know that if you have multiple cameras in your scene, you have to select your camera right here. And then that should be all good from there. And all we have to do is simply do render animation. By default, it's going to be really, really big. I'm going to go ahead and escape out of this to cancel the render. I'm going to go ahead and go to image properties, and then we're going to set our resolution something down to like 960 by 540. This is going to be a nice small previewable render. We don't need to do anything really high res right now. So I'll just simply do render animation from there. And then after it's done, all we have to do is render and then view animation. And then it's going to bring it up in the flipbook, and then there we go. So now we're actually looking at this from a real-time perspective. There's not going to be any viewport lag or anything like that, and we can make kind of our final judges right here. Some hotkeys for Blender's video preview tool. If you just do spacebar, it's going to be to pause, and then you can simply click and drag to go back and forth between your frames. So the Workbench render is really, really flat in terms of shading. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at rendering in the next chapter to get a better preview of our animation. So to set up Eevee, we're just going to switch over to rendered mode right up here. We're going to switch over to our rendering engine, Eevee, and there we go. So we're not going to get into this too much. We're just going to go, I'm going to give you guys my go-to settings for this stuff. Some go-to Eevee settings up here. I'm going to switch on ambient occlusion. That's going to help us get the contact shadows going. I'm going to really, really crank this up to something like a value of 2 to really, really make that maybe a value of something like 5 actually. And then a factor of like 2, which will help just get those contact shadows. Turn on screen space reflections. We'll do turn on motion blur. We're going to talk a bit more about motion blur as we go. All these settings here should be good. The light itself, I'm going to select that. I'm going to go over to the light properties. I'm going to switch this over to sun, and I'm going to give this a strength of value of 1. And I'm just going to kind of rotate this around to something like this. And we can kind of scrub our scene like this to see what we got. You can see our shadows here are very, very, very chunky. So what we need to do is go into our shadow properties. We're going to turn on contact shadow. We're going to crank this distance up, something like 5, which is going to just overall help those contact areas right there. I'm going to turn the angle down to something like, something, small, like 2, maybe like 5, something like that. And then you can see we're getting this really distracting specular highlight here. So what I'm going to do is just select this grid, go over to shading mode and just hit new shader. And then what we'll do is turn down specularity. And then when we come back, that should be gone. We'll leave the specular highlights on our preview objects, on our animatable objects. And then we'll set up the infinite room in the next chapter, which is going to essentially make this background kind of fade out into nothing. So this is the infinite room. It's just kind of like an environment that feels like it just fades off into nothing with a nice gradient in the background. It's very, very basic, very, very good for animation purposes. So all we got to do here is simply, we'll go into, so I'll just go into my layout mode. So we'll jump into modeling mode for a little bit. I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of this plane by hitting X and then delete. Then I'm going to go ahead and drop in a cylinder. And then I'm going to zoom in here and I'm going to do add cylinder, and then I'm going to change this over to triangle fan so that we have some triangles to work with right here. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of everything at the top. So face mode, select these, hit X, and then get rid of the faces. And then we're going to do select the bottom, and what we're going to do is we're going to set the origin down here so that we can get it flat on the ground. So I'm going to go ahead and do mesh snap, and then we'll do cursor to selected. I'll go back into object mode by hitting tab. And then we'll do object, set origin, and then origin to 3D cursor. And then from here, we'll simply just set our properties up to be 0. So now we're sitting on the origin nice and clean. So now we can actually model this out. So what we'll do is we'll just go into edit mode. I'm going to go over my edge loop right here, and I'm going to hit I to inset, just like that. I'm going to make this pretty far in like this, and then we'll just do another one like that to make sure that this area right here is going to stay flat. So this is going to be essentially the area that we animate on, and this will kind of like fade out into the background. So going back into object mode, we'll throw a subdivision modifier on this. So subdivision modifier, and then we'll do 3 and 3, and then right click shade smooth. And now we can essentially just scale this up to our scene. So I'll just go ahead and jump into my scale mode. I'm going to scale this up like this. I'll make sure that this is going down something like this, and we'll just scale this up like that. And from here, we'll kind of jump back into animation mode, and we'll kind of just take a look at it. You can see we're getting this really, really bad shadow. So what we want to do here is go back in edit mode, and then I'll jump into my edge mode right here, control click my edge loop right there. Then we'll jump back into scale mode like this, and we'll just scale this up like this. And this is going to essentially get rid of that shadow back there. I'll scale this out. You'll notice that we're getting this really bad clipping plane issue. So I'll just go ahead and fix that by going into my properties by hitting N, and then going to tool, and then we'll just do clip start and end. We'll do something like 5,000, and then we'll just end to close this. And then we'll just kind of tweak this a little bit so that we don't see anything in the background. And then we're getting that really bad specular highlight again. So I'll go back to my shading mode and then simply grab that material that we were using before with the no specularity right there. And there we go. Now we're all set up to do an Eevee render. So all we have to do is simply go to render. We'll do render animation. This is going to overwrite our previous animation. So if we wanted to version up, all we have to do is come back in here and change this version. So for me, when I'm working on projects, I just keep versioning up over and over and over. So I'll have like dozens and dozens and dozens of the same animation tweaked over and over. So I'll just render animation. We'll let that play through. And there we go. It's finished up. And then I'll just simply go to render, view animation. And there we go. Not too bad for our first test run with our animation. You'll notice that we're going to be missing something. There's no actual motion blur on this. This is a limitation currently within Eevee. It only does camera-based motion. So when we get to our jet and all that kind of stuff, it's going to work really, really well. But right now, since it's only object-based movement that's happening, the camera's not actually moving, there's no motion blur. There is going to be a little bit of a bonus chapter next, which we'll use an add-on to be able to achieve that. So this is the result with the Eevee Motion Blur add-on. And I'm going to keep this out of the main course as much as possible as it's an add-on. And I want to make sure things are going to be compatible in the future. Blender, I'm sure at some point is going to add a built-in way to do this. So it might change a little bit in the future. So here's the link to the downloads on GitHub. You just simply clone download and then download zip. The Python file within here, you're going to have to extract that. So sometimes, with Eevee, you can, or with Blender add-ons, you can actually just use the whole zip file. But in this case, we have to actually extract this. So I'm just going to drag and drop this to my desktop and then simply go to my preferences and then add-ons, install. Then I'm just going to use the Eevee Motion Blur.py install add-on, and then we'll just do a search really quick and then make sure this is going to be on. And then the setup's really, really quick. It's really straightforward. All we have to do is go to our render properties, and then it's going to be right down here. And instead of using render animation, we'll use render motion down here. So there's going to be render motion blur frame, render motion blur sequence. But before we do this, we have to switch it over to an image sequence. So this is an image sequence. So we did a movie file before. So this is much, much more of a standard workflow. The reason for this is basically so that we can just do individual frames. So if our render crashes or whatever it may be, we don't have to render the whole thing again. And then at the very end, when we get to our jet, we'll compile these and make an edit out of them and export that as a movie file. So to set up an image sequence, all you have to do is go to our output properties, go to our box. I'm just going to set this up to be version 4. And then I'm going to do file format, and then we'll just do JPEG. JPEG is totally fine for just quick flipbook and playblast or render animations. I'm going to do quality 100%, and then we'll simply go back to our render properties and then do render motion blur. The settings in here, they're pretty self-explanatory. The start frame, end frame should all sync up. And then what I'm going to do is just simply click render motion blur sequence. And then from here, it's definitely going to take a while. So make sure you save your file before you do this. The hotkey to cancel is going to be Control C. I'm going to go ahead and let this run through all the way. And we'll start this up as soon as it's done. So a good tip whenever you're rendering these frames, there's not a progress bar in Blender with this. So for me, what I do is I just open up my folder that I'm rendering this out into, and you can kind of watch the frames progress from there. It just finished up. So what I'm going to do is go back to Blender. I'm going to make sure I save this and just do a render and then view animation. There we go. That's going to wrap that up. All right, so here's where we're headed. We're going to work on this bouncing ball scene, and this is going to be a little bit challenging. It might look really, really simple and really basic, but if this is your first time doing a bouncing ball, once you get over this little bit of a learning curve, it becomes a lot easier. So it's a big challenge at first, but afterwards, it'll be really simple. So one of the main challenges that we're going to be working with here are going to be establishing a parent-child relationship. So a parent-child relationship basically means you have two different objects. The child can move freely, and the child always goes where the parent goes. So to kind of look at this in the scene here, you can see that the rotation, we have three different things. We have the rotation, we have the ball transform that's moving up and down, and then we have the squash and stretch, right? So the rotation here is happening, you can see it's happening around the origin here of the ball, the pivot point, right? But the squash and stretch down here is happening at this pivot point. There's two different pivot points. So the whole point of a parent-child relationship is to establish an object that has multiple pivot points. So I'm in a new scene here. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of my cube, and I'm just going to create a sphere to start working with. So I'm just going to right click and shade smooth to get this going. And you can see here, we have our pivot point that's working here, but we need to get a pivot point that's going to be working at the bottom for our squash and stretch. So I'm going to go ahead and move this up one. So I'm going to go 1 on Z to get that right there at the origin. Then I'm just going to create an empty. So empties are usually what you use to have a secondary pivot point on an object. So I'm just going to Shift A and then empty and then circle. And then I'm just going to go ahead and rotate this 90 degrees in X. And then I'm going to go ahead and establish a parent-child relationship for this. So the way we do this is simply whatever the child is, we select first. And then we shift select the parent. And then all we have to do simply is Control P and then set parent to object. And then you'll see here within our outliner, we now have this parent-child. So the top one is going to be the parent, and then the bottom one is going to be the child. So now if we simply, if we select our empty here and we move this around, the sphere is going to go with it. If we scale it, if we rotate it, whatever it may be, the sphere is going to go around, go along for the ride. But the child, being the sphere here, can operate independently. So before we start adding rotation to this, we're going to need a rotation shader. So it's a bit hard right now to actually see it rotating. This is going to be our final shader. So if you are shader savvy and you already know how to do all this, feel free to just jam through this chapter. You can just take this as all this stuff will be in the screenshots, or use this as a reference point to start from. I'm going to go ahead and build it from scratch. So to start, I'm just going to jump over to my shading right here, and then I'm just going to do new shader. And then we essentially need a ramp. So I'm going to do Shift A, ramp. And then I'm just going to plug this into base color. So we won't be seeing much happening right now. We're going to need to set up the UV coordinates. So I'll do Shift A, search UV, and then UV map right there. And then you'll see, okay, we're starting to get something that looks good, but it's not actually a line that's going across. So what we want to do here is take our UVs and we just want to use the Y axis here. So to do that, what we're going to do is Shift A, search, and then separate XYZ. And then we can simply lay that over top, and then we're going to choose our Y axis for the factor right there. And then we'll see as we play with our ramp, we now have a gradient that's going to be going from top to bottom, right? And then from here, what we're going to do is we're just going to set this to be constant. And then if we move this down on if we move the white point down, we'll see that we now have a hard edge. So what we're going to do here is just simply click plus. So we have three different to work with. We're going to set this black one here to be 0.45. And then we're going to set the color of that to be just a bright orange. And then we'll set the white here to be black. And then we'll set this to be 0.55. So now we have just that going in the middle. And then we're just going to set up some emission. And then so just Shift A, search emission. Go ahead and plug that in. And then from here, we'll simply do a add shader. There we go. I'm going to go ahead in my EV settings here, and then I'm just going to turn on bloom and then set the strength up to something like 40. There we go. And then jump back over to our animation tab. We can simply hook up our camera. So I'll just do N over the viewport here, and then go to view, go to lock camera. So now I can move my camera around freely. I'll go ahead and hit home to expand that view. And then we simply have our render view and we have our shaded view right here. So we're going to be wanting to use both of these. So another tip to be able to see rotation easily is to simply do Control period on our keyboard. And what that's going to do is show us our axis in the center. So as we rotate it, we can actually see that moving. And we can always turn that on here if we just simply click this on right there. So now we can clearly see it through shader, or we can see it through the axis as well. So rotating right there, we can see it rotating. So depending on what kind of computer you're on, you might want to work in shading mode. I'm going to be primarily staying in rendered mode, but just know that you might want to stick to viewport shading. So at first we worked with the timeline, and then we worked with a dope sheet. Now we're going to be working with the graph editor. So timeline is the easiest, dope sheet is next up, and then graph editor is going to be the most control. And I would say I spend 99% of the time when I'm animating inside of the graph editor. So what are the benefits of the graph editor? Let's just set a couple keyframes to play around with this. I'll go ahead and and then click location to keyframe location. And then I'll just simply move this over here And then before I move this, you'll see that we're actually moving the pivot here. So if you have that mode on currently, what you want to do is click off of that by hitting Control period. So we don't want to do that while we're actually moving this. We can have that on while we actually are playing it back, but we'll just do Control period to turn that off. So I'll just move this up here over like this, and we'll just do I location. And then with our mouse hovered over here, what I'm going to do is hit the home key. I'm going to give myself some more room to work here. And you'll see here, if we select these keyframes, we have some really interesting stuff going on. And this essentially is going to be a graph of our keyframes in terms of interpolation and the keyframe itself. So we talked a bit about interpolations before. So we have constant, linear, and Bezier, right? In the dope sheet, we have very little control over this, but in the graph editor, we can actually see how these are working, right? And then if we click on this one, you can say, okay, this is going to be linear, and then this one is going to be Bezier, right? So this is where we gain a lot of control over what these keyframes are doing when it goes from one keyframe to the other. So for example here, if I just simply select this keyframe, I can now start moving this around, right? And if I go to the middle and I can just simply keyframe it again, I'll hit I location, I'm going to select nothing, hit home again, and then that's going to frame everything. And then I can simply see here, we now have room to be able to play with this stuff. So it can kind of, go in one way and then ramp out the other way. There's a lot more control. And on top of this, we can start doing all sorts of stuff like this. If we select the keyframe, if we right click and go to our handle type, if we set this to free, for example, we now have the ability to do Bezier curves, and we can have this be more of a linear stop as well. So you gain a lot of control doing it this way. Some more handle types. If we come in here, we have something like aligned, which will just keep them together. And then we have vector. We have automatic, and then we have auto clamp. So clamp is just going to kind of flatten it. The ones I used most is just simply going to be aligned, which is going to keep them together, and free, which is just detaching them so I can move them freely. And then of course we could always come into interpolation mode and set this to something like linear, which is going to cause it to go straight. And we can always switch this back to Bezier to give us more control. So inside of our hotkey cheat sheet, we'll see we have some graph editor hotkeys. The main ones that I find that I use most are going to be all of these, but the ones specifically to get to know now are going to be the ones that are going to be highlighted here. So middle mouse scroll is simply going to zoom in and zoom out so we can see a little bit better. If you ever like zoomed out like this, if you simply just do home key, it'll snap and it'll just display whatever keyframes we currently have. A middle mouse button down is going to pan around, and then control middle mouse button up and down, it's going to scale up and down. And then if we do control middle mouse button left and right, it's going to scale left and right. If we want to see the entire timeline, we just simply do number pad period, and I'll just scale the whole timeline, or we can do home just to scale our current keyframe. So I bounce around between period, number pad period, and home a lot. So be sure to have this handy. These ones highlighted are the ones I just went over, and we'll be covering more of these as we go. So to get going on the ball bouncing, what we're going to do is we're just going to clear all these keyframes with my mouse over the graph editor here. I'm going to hit A and then X and then delete keyframes to clear that out. And then I'll just go ahead and zero this out, and then we'll just do 1 on the Z axis. And then what we'll do is we'll just go to frame 0. I'll just keyframe it there, I location, and then we'll go to frame 20 and do the same thing, I location, and then we'll go to frame 10. And then we'll go ahead and lift this up like this, something like that. I'm just going to do a value of 4 to make it exact, and then we'll just do I for insert keyframe and then location. And then to be able to loop this, what we're going to do is just start frame will just be 0, and then end frame will be 20. And we'll just go ahead and hit our home key to zoom in on that, and then we'll just hit play. So now this is a classic animation cycle, right? And the problem with this though is that it's of course, coming to a slow stop when it hits the ground. So we need to fix that. So what we're going to do here is select our keyframes over here, and we're going to right click and then go to handle. Then we're going to set this to free. And then we're simply going to move this up like this, so that's going to be a hard, sharp hit whenever it hits the ground. So it goes right back up. And you can see here, there's going to be a 1 frame lag right now because we're hitting this as 0 and then we're hitting it again. So essentially we need to get rid of that last frame. So what we'll do is we'll actually start the frame at 1. So there's no actual duplicates in terms of frames here. So that's going to look a little bit better. Great. And then we'll work on this squash next. So what we want to do here is whenever this hits the ground, we want this to absorb the movement and turn that into a squash. So it's going to go down and then the impact is going to be absorbed with the scale. So what we want to do here is give us a little bit of breathing room for this. So what I'm going to do is simply move these keyframes over 2 frames. So I'll move this back 2 frames and this forward 2 frames. So I'll go ahead and grab this, and the hotkey to snap this is just going to be X, and that's going to snap it on the original value that I was using. I'm just going to go over 2 frames, and then the same thing with this one, just over 2 frames. So this is on 2, this is on 18. I'll just go ahead and tighten this up a little bit. And then what I'm going to do here is on this frame 2 here, I'm going to select my scale here, and then just do insert keyframe and then scaling. And then we'll go over to 18, which is where it lands, and then we'll do the same thing, insert scaling. And then what we'll do is we'll go to frame 20, and then we'll simply scale this in like that. We'll do something like 0.5. And then I'll go ahead and insert that keyframe again. And then what we can simply do here, instead of going back and redoing it, what we can do is simply select this, we'll hit Control-C to copy, and then we'll go over to frame 0 and Control-V to paste. So we're pasting that in there. And then from here, we'll see, okay, it's close, but it's not quite there. The reason for this is if we hit our home key to zoom in here, we'll see that, okay, it's got this ease in absorption, and we want this to be linear because, this keyframe here is going to be very linear in, and we want the same motion to start the scaling, right? So we'll go ahead and jump in here. I'll select if we come in here, we can just focus on the Y. If we close off the Z in the X scale, I'll go ahead and select both of these right here, right click, and then handle type is going to be free. And then I'll simply move this down like this. So the arc is going to be really sharp there. So there we go. Right, something like that. And there we go. Classic ball bouncing. So at this point we have an animation cycle, but our timeline is currently looping back and forth. So if we do something like this, where we set our in frame to something like 120, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit period on my number pad to zoom that out, you can see that our animation is going to stop, right? As soon as it goes past that, it's not going to do anything. So we want this to loop over time, not just play back the timeline in a loop, right? So the way we do that is by using animation modifiers, and this one specifically we're going to use here is going to be a cycle modifier. So to access this, we just simply hit N over our keyboard, and we'll get our properties over here. This is going to be properties for our keyframes currently, but we want to get the properties for the actual channel itself. So while I have my empty here selected, I'm going to select Y. And then as soon as we select that, we'll notice that we get access to our modifiers over here. And these modifiers work very, very similar to the traditional modifiers that we're used to over here in our geometry modifications, right? It's going to be a property that's going to be applied on top of this, but it's going to be a non-destructive workflow. So what I'm going to do is here is simply add modifier, and then we'll just do cycles. And you'll see here, right off the bat, it's going to be looping, right? It's not looping everything. It's only doing this one channel, right? We got Y scale. So if we want to loop the other one, all we have to do is select this one, go over to our Z. So we can just turn off the other two because they're not actually moving right now. And we'll simply select Z and then go to modifiers and then cycles. And then you notice that we have a problem here. It's not looking at all like what we expect, right? So what's happening here, if we, I'm just going to hit my home key, And what's happening here, it's going to repeat on the last frame, right? And our last frame isn't actually 2 or 18. It's going to be 0 and 20, right? So it's repeating itself too early, essentially. So what we got to do here is simply take this keyframe, and we want to extrude it along the axis right here. So to do that, we're just going to simply turn off our cycles. We'll just turn that off for now. So it's just disabled, and then we'll simply hit I, and then we'll insert another location keyframe right there at 20. Then we'll do the same thing for 0. So I, location, and then we'll turn this back on, and we'll see now we have that animation as fixed. And then if we hit number pad period with nothing selected, it'll zoom out, and we'll see that actually looping across there. So there we go. There's some other modifiers that we're going to get into as we go. There's simply like noise, for example, limits. We're going to be touching more of these as we go. So animation drivers, simply put, are ways for us to get objects to move without actually keyframing them. We're going to use data from other areas of the scene. So this specific cube right here has a very, very basic keyframe animation, right? This one is moving because it has a driver attached to it that's referencing this movement, right? So this is where you get into like rigging and a lot of stuff like that. It's ways to make things move without actually directly making them move. So for example, if I just clear this out, it's not going to move anymore, right? So what we want to do is take the Y channel from here and make the X move based off of that. So simply put, I'm just going to right click, and then we're going to do add driver. And then we're going to change the type from a scripted expression. We'll get into that in a little bit. We'll change this to averaged value, which is really just us saying take the direct value of something. We'll take the object here, and we'll just select cube 3 for this most basic example, because that's what we're referencing up here. And then we'll choose here transform channel, and then we'll take the type X location to Y location. And that's really it. I'm just going to click out of that now, and then we'll see, okay, now this X location is being driven by the location of this Y right there. So how we can apply that to our scene here is with rotation. And so we could come in here and simply keyframe this rotating around, and that's one way to do it. The benefit of doing it with a driver in this specific case is it's much more modular. It's much more easy to control. And we're going to use a very, very basic expression to do this. So the axis that we're going to want to rotate on is simply going to be Y. So I'm going to right click on the Y and then just do add driver. And then we're going to do scripted expression. And this time we're just going to set the expression to frame. And we're just going to exit out of any variables right here. And we'll just use frame for this. And I'll just hit enter. And then when we come out of this, we'll see that, okay, now it's moving. It's rotating, right? It's going to be way, 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 way too fast. And I'll break this down a little bit more for you. So we do edit driver. I currently set the frame, which means it's going to take the frame right here and put it into the channel, right? And if we want this frame to be a lower value, all we have to do is divide it. So we'll just do something like divide by 10. I'll hit enter, and then we'll simply move it like this. So now we can see we have a rotation that's kind of automatic. We don't actually need to keyframe it. I'm going to go ahead and speed that up a little bit more. We'll just do something like divide by 5, for example. So it's a little bit better. All right, so next up we need to get this going down the stairs. So I have a stair asset that's going to be located in the starter kit downloads. So I'm just going to import OBJ and then go to our starter kit and then simply do stairs version 1 and go ahead and import that. And there we go. So now what we want to do is we want to use our empty right here to get it to go down the stairs. Currently it's got a scale channel on it, but we want this to be the controller for going down the stairs as well. So what we'll do is we'll simply just go to frame 0. And then we'll work on our keyframes going every 20 frames, right? When the same frames that are with the cycles. And from here, we'll just simply move this up. The exact values of this, so I set this up so it's going to be 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. for exact values to make it a little bit easier on us. So what I'll do here is simply go to frame 0, up on Z on 1, make that 5 meters up, and then I'll simply hit I to insert a location keyframe, and then I'll go to 20, and then I'll simply move this down right here. So move that over and then down, and I just want to make sure it's going to be exactly 4 on this. We'll just move that forward a little bit. And then we'll just simply do I location as well. And then from here we can, kind of, the scale is going to be all done for us. So I'm going to go ahead and just hide the scale. And we're going to go ahead and hide the Y location as well, because we're not going to be working with that. We're going to be primarily working with X and Z location. So from here, if we check this out, it's going to be very Bezier. So what we want to do is just select all, right click, and then do interpolation linear. And then essentially we just want to repeat this going down, right? So we'll do the next one. We'll go to frame 40 right here, and then we'll move this down like this. Move that down, and we'll make sure that we set our Z-axis to be 3, and then we'll simply put that in there like that. And then we'll simply do I location. And essentially we just need to repeat this a couple more times. So we'll go to frame 60, move this down and over, and then we'll go down to value of 2, and then we'll simply do I location, and then we'll go to 80, same drill as before. So we'll make sure the exact meter is going to be 1. We'll do insert I location, and then one more. So we'll go up to 100. Set this down to 0, somewhere right in there, and then I location. So to be able to see all of our keyframes here, what we'll do is we'll just hit home. And if we play this back, we'll see, okay, it's, kind of sort of getting there, right? But we have one little problem. I'm going to go ahead and move our light so that we can see this a little bit better. So I'm just going to move this out here so that the shadow isn't looking so weird. So we have one little problem right now, and that is that as it bounces, it's currently the squash and stretch isn't starting on the right frame, right? So if we look here, see the problem here is it starts to squash before it hits. So what we need to do here is simply go to our frame 0 and then select our Y. So it's going to be our up axis, and we're going to copy it, and then we're going to move over 2 frames, and then we're going to paste it. So Control C, Control V. That way it doesn't actually leave the stair until it's completed with a squash and stretch. And we're essentially going to repeat this for all of the keyframes. So we'll copy this right here, and then we'll go back 2 frames, paste. So come in here and copy this, and then paste. We'll go over 2 more frames, paste. So we want to repeat this for each one. So select that, 1, 2, paste, and then 1, 2, 1, 2, and paste. So we're essentially having 4 frames of it sitting there. So you want to make sure that you Control C while you're over the graph here. We'll go back 2, then forward 2, and then we'll repeat this one as well. Back 2, forward 2, and then back 2, and then forward 2. And now we'll see that, okay, it's looking much, much more believable because it's kind of sitting there. And then the last problem that we have here is simply we need to get this to extend outwards, right? So that's going to be with our X location. So at this point we can just hide our Z, and we'll just hit home. Essentially what we need to do is we need to just simply extend this, right? And if we come up here, we'll simply go all the way to frame 120, and then we'll go ahead and hit I to insert our keyframe on location, and then we'll simply move this up. And then if we want to snap it, we simply hit Y, and then we do that, just like that. And at this point, we could attempt to get rid of all these keyframes in the middle. I'm going to go ahead and leave them all there. And that's that, and we'll work on the render next. So the rendering part will be a little bit of review, but we'll cover a couple of new things as we go, just in terms of presentation and that kind of stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and import an object. I have this infinite room that we have set up from last time. I have it saved out as an OBJ, so I can import that quickly for these test animations just to give us some kind of background. The bloom is already set on. We're going to turn on ambient occlusion. I'm going to go ahead and take the distance and put this up to something much higher, like 2, 3, something like that. The factor, I'm going to set this up to 2 to kind of get that little bit of a darker occluded feel. And then we'll turn on screen space reflections, motion blur, and then we'll come to our light, tweak that a little bit. So we'll go to our light properties, we'll go to shadow, contact shadows on. We'll go ahead and turn the distance up to something like 1 to make sure that we see those contacts as the ball hits the ground. Really nice. And then I'm just going to crank this up to something like 10,000, just to make it a little bit brighter. We'll kind of move this off the frame a little bit more. I'm going to scale this up and Redis to make the shadows a bit softer. So we'll do something like 3 there. So that's going to give us some soft shadows. My keyboard and my shortcut thing here is going to kind of make this glitch. Bear with me on that one. And then we'll just set this up to be complementary colors. So if you're not familiar with color theory, a very, very basic way to present your stuff is simply do complementary colors, which is essentially I'm going to make this blue, some kind of like darker, maybe desaturated blue a little bit more, maybe a little bit darker. And essentially what we want to do is that's going to be the opposite of our orange, right? And then this is going to be like 80% of the frame, and then our orange is going to be the 20%. And basically whatever is the smaller in terms of color value is where our eye is going to be focused. So we'll play around with that. Maybe I'll darken up the light a little bit. We'll do something like 7500 maybe. The exact values here don't matter too much. There we go. We'll just kind of frame our camera up like this. And then we just have to set our output settings. So we'll go to output properties and then make sure you have your file saved somewhere. And then we'll do // render. And we'll just do bouncing ball and then do /version1. This is, basic folder structure that I like to use to kind of touch up on this a little bit more. But basically what this does is it puts whatever you're animating into its own folder. And then there's going to be a version in there. And then we're going to have that image sequence living inside of there. So if we ever need to version up, you'll see this a lot later on when we get to the jet. But basically when we version up, we'll essentially be putting that image sequence into a new folder. And then I'll just go ahead and switch this over to JPEG 100%. I'm going to do version 2 since this is the second one I have rendered out. And at this point, we can simply go to our render. You can either do render animation here, or you can do a render motion blur sequence using the plugin. One thing I just want to touch up on really quick before we actually hit the render button is our output properties. So again, 1920 by 1080, that's going to be way, way, way too much, especially for the first time we're going to be rendering this. So we'll just do something like 960 by 540 to make it a little bit smaller, and then we can always up-res after a few different iterations. So I'm going to go ahead and render animation. I'm going to go ahead and hit the render motion blur. Go ahead and render it out like that. There we go. I'll finish rendering, and then we'll just do view animation. Go ahead and play that back. There we go. That's going to wrap up the bouncing ball.